Welcome to part 2 of Gearwig's video tutorial series on power attacks. In this part we'll cover slams and tramples. Slams and trample power attacks have a lot in common. Both require a model to have both its movement and action available. If it had sacrificed one or the other, it cannot make a slam or a trample. And both power attacks must be declared before a model begins moving. Any effect that prevents a model from charging, for instance a penalty to its speed stat, also prevents a model from trampling or slamming. When a model makes a slam power attack, it must first declare a target in its line of sight. It then turns to directly face that target, and then moves up to its speed plus 3 directly toward that target. Unlike a charge, it cannot move along a different line and end with it in its melee range. This is not a legal slam. A slam must be directly toward. So it must move along a line connecting the center of its target's base and the center of its base. It's a very strict movement. Much like a charge, a slam stops short if the slamming model contacts an obstruction, like a building, an obstacle, like a wall, or any other model. If our ironclad here attempted to slam Baldar at the top center, that slam would fail because he would contact the wall before he got Baldar in his half-inch power attack melee range. Slamming models move at half speed through rough terrain, unless of course they have Pathfinder. The Pathfinder advantage also allows them to slam through linear obstacles without penalty. A slamming model cannot cut a slam short until it has its target in its half-inch power attack melee range. If a slam movement ends before the target is in the slamming model's melee range, say because it contacted a linear obstacle, another model, or it just ran out of distance, then the slam fails and the slamming model's activation immediately ends, very similar to a charge failing. If our ironclad here declared a slam on the Gnarlhorn, the slam would fail because he would contact the Wolf of Orboros and end the slam before he got him in his melee range. It would be nice if he could slam at sort of an angle, the way you can charge, and end like this. But that is illegal. Remember, a slam must be directly toward the Gnarlhorn. It would be better if we had Nemo activate first here. He could zap the Wolf of Orboros, clear him out of the way, and then when the ironclad activated, he could slam the Gnarlhorn legally. A model that makes a successful slam movement against its target makes a single melee attack roll against that target. If the target's base is larger, if say a medium base model had tried to slam our large base Gnarlhorn here, then the slamming model would have a -2 penalty to its slam melee attack roll. It is more difficult to slam larger models, although possible. Like a charge, a slam needs to move at least 3 inches to be most effective. If a slamming model moved less than 3 inches, it still makes an attack roll against its target, but its target is not considered to be slammed. A target that is hit by a slam like this, a slam that doesn't move the requisite 3 inches, suffers a damage roll with a POW equal to the strength of the slammer. When a slamming model does move at least 3 inches, and hits with its slam attack roll, its target is slammed. A slammed target first moves a d6 inches directly away from its attacker. This distance is halved if the slamming model, the attacking model, has a smaller base than the target. A slammed target also moves at half speed if he is moving through rough terrain, even if he has Pathfinder. A slammed target's movement immediately ends if it contacts an obstruction like a building, an obstacle like a wall, or a model with an equal or larger base. A slammed model will move through other models with smaller bases than their own. If a slammed model ends up directly on top of a smaller model through this movement, the smaller model is shuffled to the side using the rule of least disturbance, moving at the smallest possible distance to end up in a legal position, a position where it doesn't overlap another model. Note that when a slammed target is forced to move like this, it is not an advance, and thus free strikes cannot be taken if a slammed model moves out of the melee range of an enemy model. If our ironclad slammed the Gnarlhorn, it would move directly away from it, a d6 inches, until it contacted an equal base, this feral warpwolf. So here the slam movement would stop, and then we would resolve the other slam effects. If, instead, our hunter had just slammed the feral warpwolf and succeeded on its attack roll, it would roll a d6 to see the distance that the warpwolf would be slammed, and then cut that result in half because the hunter is a smaller base than the feral warpwolf. Let's assume he rolled a 6 for slam distance, cut it in half, and ended up slamming the feral 3 inches. He would be slammed through the Wolf of Orboros, which would land up just about on top of him. The wolf would then have to be moved the least amount of distance to get him to a legal spot like this. Here the movement would end for both models, and we'd resolve the slam effects. After a slammed target's forced movement is resolved, the slammed target is knocked down. If it contacted any models with equal or smaller bases during its slam movement, those models are knocked down as well. If it contacted a model with a larger base than its own, that larger model isn't knocked down. The slammed model just bounces off him and he doesn't care. So when the feral were slammed through the Wolf of Orboros, the feral would be knocked down because he was the target of a slam, and the Wolf of Orboros would have been knocked down as well, because he was contacted by a slammed target with a base equal or larger than his own. Before, when the Gnarlhorn were slammed into the feral, he would get knocked down because he was the target of a slam power attack, and the feral, who was an equal base, would also be knocked down. Note that the Gnarlhorn didn't move through the feral the way the feral moved through the Wolf of Orboros. You only move through a model if his base is smaller. He just contacted the feral, and the slam ended there. But just contacting him here, base to base, is enough to knock the feral down, because the feral and the Gnarlhorn have the same base. If a medium base model, say a Gorax, were slammed into the feral, the Gorax would be knocked down because he was the target of a power attack, but the feral was too big to be knocked down by such a small dude, and he would have been fine. If the slammed target cannot be knocked down, if it has a special rule like steady that forbids it from being knocked down, it still must sacrifice its movement or action if it activates later in that same turn. This would only really come up if you slammed your own model on your turn and then tried to activate him afterward. If that steady model did not have to sacrifice his movement or action, then you could very cheaply get some free movement just by slamming him toward your enemy and then having him charge after that. So that is not allowed. After all the slam movement has been resolved, and all the knockdown effects have been applied, only then do you apply damage. So even if a slam is sure to obliterate its target, you still move the target to where it will get slammed, you handle any models that might be contacted by it, and you handle any knockdown effects. After all that is resolved, you handle damage rolls. The model that was slammed, in this case the Gnarlhorn Satyr, suffers a damage roll with a power equal to the slammer's strength. This damage roll can be boosted like normal. The slammed target suffers an extra die of damage on this damage roll if it contacted a model with an equal or larger base in the slam. So, since our Gnarlhorn were slammed into the feral, and the feral is an equal or larger base, then the Gnarlhorn would have to suffer an additional die of damage. If the Ironclad decided to boost his damage roll, that would be a total of 4 dice. Other models that were contacted during the slam suffer what's called a collateral damage roll. Only models with equal or smaller bases suffer a collateral damage roll. Our feral here is an equal base to the Gnarlhorn, so he will take damage. If the Gnarlhorn had been slammed into our Gargantuan with a huge base, the Gargantuan would not have suffered collateral damage at all. It's too big to care about that. The collateral damage roll is an unboostable damage roll with a power equal to the slammer's strength. This damage roll is considered to be simultaneous with the slammed target's damage roll, so the Gnarlhorn and the feral here would both suffer damage at the same time. When the feral were slammed into the Wolf of Orboros, he contacted the Wolf of Orboros. So, just like in the other example, the Wolf of Orboros would suffer a collateral damage roll. Unlike the other example, the feral would not suffer an additional die of damage. Remember, the Gnarlhorn suffered an additional die because he contacted an equal or larger base. He had contacted the feral. Here the feral contacts a Wolf of Orboros, but it is not an equal or larger base. So while the Wolf of Orboros is still getting plowed over by the Wolf here and will suffer damage, the Wolf doesn't take bonus damage for being bonked into his own little guy here. He's too small to care about that. Note that a slammed target also suffers an additional die of damage if he contacts an obstruction, like a building, or an obstacle, like a wall, even if he has Pathfinder. Like we stated earlier, tramples require a model to have both its movement and action available at the beginning of its turn, and anything that prevents a model from charging also prevents it from trampling. Light war beasts and light warjacks cannot trample. Unlike slams and charges, when a model decides to trample, it doesn't pick a target, it just picks a direction. It then faces that direction and moves up to its speed plus 3 inches. It cannot change its facing at any point during the trample, even at the very end. It can cut its trample short, unlike a charge or a slam, since it doesn't have a target it's going for, it's just a direction, and it can move any distance up to its speed plus 3. Similar to charges and slams, a trampling model's movement immediately ends if it contacts an obstruction like a building, an obstacle like a wall, or a medium or larger base. Note that this allows the trampling model to move through small bases, which is the whole point of the trample. Trampling models move at half speed through rough terrain unless they have Pathfinder, and the Pathfinder advantage also allows them to trample through linear obstacles like walls. A trampling model must have open ground to land on to finish its trample, so while our Warden here could trample through the Black 13th member and the Gobber, it has no place to land. So the only legal spot to stop its trample would be right in front of the Black 13th member. It couldn't get any further, and it wouldn't thus contact any of those models. If our Warden here declared a trample in the direction of the Hunter up near the top, he could trample as far as the Hunter's base, but as soon as he contacted it, his trample would end. He is not allowed to move through this medium base model. If he instead decided to trample in the direction of Nemo, he could stomp right over our poor Black 13th member here and end up right in Nemo's face. When you make a trample movement, you don't handle free strikes in the normal fashion. Normally, as soon as you left the melee range of an enemy model, you'd stop, you'd handle the free strike and go from there, but tramples work differently. You wait until you've completed the entire trample movement, and then you handle any trample attack rolls, and only then do you do free strikes. As soon as the trample movement is complete, the trampling model makes one melee attack, a trample attack roll, against each small base model it moved through on its way over. So in this movement here, we move through the Black 13th member, so we get to make one melee attack against that target. If the attack hits, the target suffers a damage roll with a power equal to the strength of the trampling model. Like normal, both the attack roll and damage roll for these trample attacks are boostable. Once all the trample attacks have been resolved, only then do you do free strikes. Models that were trampled through are not permitted to take free strikes. So while the Warden here did enter the melee range of our Black 13th member and then leave it, which would normally allow a free strike, since she was contacted, she does not get to make the free strike. Even if the trample attack roll against her failed, she's too busy jumping out of the way to strike at the Warden. The Stormblade officer, who was not contacted during the trample, can make a free strike like normal. And by contacted in this sense, I mean move through. A trampling model only gets to make trample attacks against models it completely moves through. So while our trample here might end up base to base with Nemo, the trample itself doesn't contact Nemo. He doesn't make a trample attack against Nemo. If our Warden were worried about free strikes, he could consider trampling in a different direction. This direction would contact both the Black 13th member and the Stormblade. Both models would suffer trample attack rolls, and neither would get to make free strikes. Although since we can't change our facing at the end of the trample, we might not have Nemo in our melee range here, which could be important. Our original trample angle might be the safer bet here. Remember that tramples are power attacks, which means they are melee special attacks, and while they replace your initial attack rolls, you can still buy additional attacks at the end of a power attack. Once our trample's been resolved, we can start buying additional attacks against Nemo, who is in our melee range. We wouldn't have been able to charge Nemo because there were models in the way and our charge would have failed. But we can trample through them, land next to Nemo, and start buying additional attacks. This is a common tactic large war beasts and warjacks use to get through screening infantry to valuable models in the second line. Note also that tramples don't have a target, and thus they can't fail. So you can trample, say, 8 inches into the middle of open ground, and then continue your activation like normal. Which means this Warden, who has the ability to cast his Warlock spells, could trample 8 inches forward, and then be forced to use, say, a ranged attack spell for a rather impressive threat range. Both slams and tramples are very much like charges, in which a model uses both its movement and action to combine into one maneuver. Like all power attacks, they are situational, and you will only use them occasionally. But when the situation arises, whether you need to stomp over a group of light infantry or send your opponent's large models bowling into each other, both attacks can be key components in a winning strategy. Thank you for watching. Look for part 3 in this series, where we cover both single and double-handed throws, plus some other odds and ends with power attacks. You can see more video tutorials, battle reports, and articles at gearwig.com. You can email me at boss@gearwig.com, or check out our Facebook or Twitter pages. Thank you.